freedom is a peculiar thing in the sense that I've never met someone who is not in favor of freedom. Everyone wants freedom. Everyone regards freedom as something that ought to be pursued or cherished or protected. And freedom is something that is regularly or generally accepted as something that's worth fighting for, and it's worth dying for. And the great martyrs of history were all the martyrs who were willing to die for freedom. Yet, people don't seem to agree on what it actually means, and there are some fascinating stories about wars being fought where both sides claim to be on the side of liberty or freedom. And one of the worst example I know of was the Spartacus rebellion in Rome, where Spartacus, as we know, was a gladiator or a slave, and he had this rebellion against the Roman Republic. It was before the empire, for freedom, and his rebellion was framed as a fight for freedom. But his rebellion was interpreted by the Romans as a challenge to Roman liberty, because the Republic was seen as the manifestation of Roman freedom. So to rise up against the Roman Republic is to rise up against freedom. And when Spartacus' revolt was eventually crushed by Crassus, he had 6,000 of his men crucified all along the Appian Road towards Rome, as a sign of what will happen to people who dare challenge the Roman conception of freedom, which is ironic because the whole revolt was about freedom. So I've never met someone who disagrees with freedom being important. What I could say in terms of the second part of the question is that generally there are many ways to think about freedom. There's religious freedom, there's freedom of speech, there's economic freedom, so it diverges into different paths. But broadly speaking, most people who have tried to sort of frame it into categories would say that there are, broadly speaking, two categories, two ways of thinking about freedom. There might be more, but if I can just reference one or two people. So one, Thomas Sowell, I want to start with him. He didn't speak about freedom as such, but more about human nature, and he speaks about the constrained view and the unconstrained view. And so the constrained view is to say that we are constrained, we are fallible beings, we are not perfect, we cannot be perfected. And the unconstrained view is that if we do the right things, we as human beings we can unleash our potential. And so the reason why I mention this is because the way we think about human nature generally leads to the way we think about freedom. And if I can mention maybe two interesting views, we know that Isaiah Berlin is maybe the most example division. He talks about positive freedom and negative freedom. In other words, freedom for something as opposed to freedom, not to be constrained. But there's I want to mention two people just to sort of explain what I think the discussion is, and I'd be curious to hear Martin's view on this. One is D.C. Schindler, who's a philosopher in Washington, D.C. He divides freedom into two categories. The one is what he calls freedom from above, and the other one is freedom from below. And what he means by that is freedom from above, he links to the Western tradition, and freedom from above essentially says that there's a hierarchy and God is at the top, and but we as human beings are very small. We are there's much bigger things out there that are bigger than us, and so there's God, and then below God, but also above us, we find our traditions and we find our communities and our cultures and our heritage and so forth. And then we're basically, in a way you can say, at the bottom, we as individuals. And so freedom from below is what he says is the hierarchy is in a way being tipped around by the modern way of thinking about freedom, to say that actually it's the individual that's at the top. And the individual who's at the top can choose whether he wants to believe in God or whether he wants to protect his heritage or his tradition. So the one way of thinking about it is to put the person or the individual at the bottom, and the other one is to put him at the top. And then another interesting, I'll just conclude with that, is I recently discovered a philosopher in the Netherlands, Annelien de Dijn, who wrote the book is just called Freedom. And she says there are two ways of thinking about freedom. The one she calls democratic freedom, and the other one she calls civil freedom, or burgerlijke vrijheid. And democratic freedom, interestingly enough, she equates it to the ancient or the traditional view. She says democratic freedom means self-governance by the people, by the nation. So when the people govern themselves, it's a democratic conception of freedom. And the other way of thinking about it is the civil freedom. In other words, it's the freedom of the citizen. So when the citizen can organize his life the way he sees fit, that's a way of thinking about freedom as something that belongs to the citizen. So maybe that's a good way to start from my side.
Well, thank you. That's very useful to chart out the different ways in which freedom can play a role and how often there's a tension between those views. I often think that the language used by the writers does a disservice to some of the ideas. When you think about Isaiah Berlin's idea of positive freedom or the unconstrained vision, both of those things, just from the tag, sound wonderful. But of course, the authors point out why they're so dangerous. So Martin, I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. The idea of positive freedom, the idea that the state must supply you with various resources so that you can be free, and this idea of people can become gods, that they are unconstrained in their potential, and what kind of a society you would design if you think about that conception of freedom and the dangers of that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So Hayek goes into a lot of detail when he talks about the knowledge problem and so on, and he talks about what he would call the false individualists of effectively the French Revolution, which he calls effectively the French rationalists. And their whole thinking, and these people call themselves liberals, much to my dismay, and they call themselves individualists, much to my dismay. And their idea effectively was, in the same way that Thomas Sowell talks about the unconstrained freedom, and this is this idea that there is this capital R reason out there that the human individual can latch onto and design perfection. It is this idea that kind of came with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment had many wonderful ideas, but this is maybe not one of them. It is that the order we have in society is not a spontaneous one, but because human beings have access to this thing called reason, we can, as individuals, but as small groups as well, design this perfect society where there is no fallibility. And then you have the other side of that, which, I mean, I agree, this idea, the negative freedom, but it's not a negative concept. It's actually a very empowering concept. The idea that people are fallible, individuals are bad, people are self-interested, and some people are simply stupid. And we need to give those individuals that room, that domain, where they can do the least harm to society. Hayek again, speaking specifically about Adam Smith, but also then bringing in Edmund Burke and Alexis de Tocqueville. He says that the way they went about conceiving of freedom was a system under which bad men can do the least harm. And that is this liberal individualist constrained view of freedom, where people are constrained by social forces, they are constrained by their communities, their religions, certainly. But the key thing is that is all voluntary, ultimately. And when you introduce the involuntary element to it, you do eventually come onto this unconstrained path, because when you as the individual do not get to act according to what your own conception of the good is, you are effectively acting according to someone else's. That is not an avoidable step. You're either acting according to your own or that of someone else. And when you have that thing where you are acting according to the conception of someone else, then you are hurtling down the road of this idea of the perfectibility. You will have the powerful class that will have this design for society, which ultimately is destructive to freedom.